What kind of terrifying courage does it take to destroy a beautiful thing over and over again, solely in the hope that something truer, rawer, and more undeniable might rise from the wreckage? That is the question you must ask yourself before you even dare to step into the visual hurricane that is the work of Willem de Kooning. We are not talking about a polite painter here. We are not talking about a man who set up an easel to paint pretty flowers that match the upholstery. Nor are we discussing a bohemian dilettante throwing paint around in a fit of drunken stupor. We are talking about a Dutch stowaway who arrived in America with nothing but the clothes on his back, a rigorous old-world academy training, and a burning, desperate ambition to dismantle the entire history of Western art with a brush in one hand and a scraper in the other. To understand de Kooning is to understand that painting is not a hobby, nor is it merely a profession. It is a combat sport. It is a brawl with the material, a desperate wrestling match with the ghosts of art history, and a visceral, sweaty engagement with the very idea of human flesh. Most people look at abstract art and think it is a scam. They see swirls, slashes, and drips, and they think a child could do it. If that is your perspective, listen closely because I am going to cure you of that ignorance right now. Willem de Kooning was the heavyweight champion of abstract expressionism, but unlike his contemporaries who sought to transcend the world and float into some metaphysical spiritual void, de Kooning dug his heels into the mud. He refused to leave the physical world behind. His historical importance lies in a singular, stubborn, and incredibly difficult fact. He refused to choose between the figure and the abstract. He stood right in the center of the most violent artistic debate of the 20th century, the war between representational art and total abstraction, and he decided to occupy the battlefield itself. While Jackson Pollock was dripping paint to escape the figure and reach the absolute, de Kooning was using the aggressive energy of abstraction to summon the figure back from the dead, dragging it, kicking and screaming through a storm of oil paint, charcoal and turpentine. To truly grasp the magnitude of his achievement and to insulate yourself against the shallow interpretations of casual observers, you have to understand the texture of his genius. This man was a craftsman before he was an artist. He was trained in Rotterdam at the Academy of Fine Arts and Techniques, a place deeply rooted in the guild traditions of the Netherlands. He did not just learn self-expression, he learned discipline. He knew how to faux finish wood to look like marble, he knew how to letter signs with mathematical precision, and he understood the complex chemistry of pigments and drying oils. This is crucial, because when you look at his chaotic surfaces, you are not seeing accidents, you are seeing a master manipulator of viscosity. De Kooning did not just buy paint and squeeze it onto a canvas. He cooked it. He was an alchemist of the studio. He whipped his pigments with water, with safflower oil, with solvents, and occasionally with egg, creating emulsions that were creamy, slippery, and chemically unstable. He wanted the paint to move fast. He needed it to keep up with the velocity of his thought. When you look at those slashing strokes in his major works, you are seeing a high-speed collision between a loaded brush and a resistant surface. He often used sign painter's brushes, long, whippy liners that were difficult to control, which allowed him to snap the paint onto the canvas with a flick of the wrist, creating lines that were whiplash thin one moment and exploding into broad, aggressive swathes of color the next. This is where we get into the real meat of his technique, and where you need to abandon your desire for easy resolution. De Kooning was an eraser. He was a destroyer. He would work on a canvas for months, sometimes years. He would build up an image, a complex architecture of forms, and then in a fit of dissatisfaction he would scrape it all down. He would take a palette knife, a scraper, or even a piece of cardboard, and drag it across the wet paint, blurring the image, leaving ghost-like traces of what was there before. This is what art historians call a palimpsest, a surface that bears the scars of its own history. Why does this matter? Because it gives the painting a nervous system. It creates a geological sense of time. When you stand before one of his canvases, you are not looking at a frozen moment. You are looking at a record of struggle. You see the layers of indecision, the violent corrections, the refusal to settle for an easy solution. The painting becomes an archaeological site where the viewer can excavate the artist's process, seeing the remnants of previous battles fighting their way to the surface through the translucent layers of white and grey. There is a concept de Kooning spoke of, which he called the slipping glimpse. This is essential for unlocking his visual language and silencing the critics who claim his work is merely messy. Think about when you are driving a car at high speed or walking through a crowded metropolis like New York. You do not see things in fixed static portraits. You see fragments. You see a flash of a shoulder, the blur of a red coat, the angle of a jaw, all mixed in with the reflection of a shop window and the grey of the pavement. That is how de Kooning painted. He painted the sensation of seeing, not the object seen. He tried to capture the fluidity of perception itself. His forms are always in a state of becoming or dissolving. You might see a shape that suggests a breast or a thigh or a grin, but the moment you try to pin it down, it slips away into a slash of crimson or a smear of ochre. He forces you, the viewer, to work. He forces you to participate in the chaos. He does not spoon-feed you a narrative. He throws you into the deep end of the pool and demands that you swim. Let us be brutal about his aesthetic. It is not polite. It is arguably the most aggressive aesthetic in the history of American art. De Kooning did not care about good taste. In fact, he despised it. He famously said that flesh was the reason oil paint was invented, and he treated the paint exactly like flesh. It is pink, it is raw, it is sometimes muddy and dirty. He mixed high art with low culture in a way that offended the purists of his day. He looked at Rubens and Michelangelo, but he also looked at billboards and trashy magazine advertisements. He took the grin of a model from a cigarette ad, cut it out, and smashed it onto the body of a Mesopotamian idol. This creates a visual shock, a dissonance that vibrates in the eye. He was not afraid of ugliness. In fact, he found a tremendous vitality in what others considered ugly. The vulgarity of the modern world, the neon lights, the concrete, the noise, the cheap advertising, all of it found its way into his brushwork. He chewed it up and spat it out as high art. You must appreciate the physicality of his line. In art history, we often talk about line versus color, the Florentine versus the Venetian. De Kooning obliterated that distinction. His line is color, and his color is line. He would draw with charcoal directly into the wet paint, ripping through the creamy surface, leaving jagged black scars that define form and then contradict it. He would use the handle of the brush to gouge into the pigment, excavating the canvas underneath. This is tactile painting. It appeals to your sense of touch. You can feel the grease of the oil, the grit of the charcoal, the resistance of the canvas. It is a somatic experience. He famously painted with the canvas on the floor sometimes, or rotated it constantly on the easel, so that he would lose track of which way was up. This destroyed the horizon line. It destroyed the traditional perspective that had ruled painting since the Renaissance. In a de Kooning painting, there is no background and no foreground. Everything is pushed right up against the glass, fighting for space. It is claustrophobic, intense, and utterly mesmerizing. One cannot discuss de Kooning without diving into the sheer athleticism of his method. This was not a man who sat quietly dabbing at a canvas like a Sunday painter. He painted with his whole body. The size of his brushstrokes corresponds to the sweep of an arm, the lunge of a torso. When you look at the large ribbons of paint, you are seeing a kinetic record of a physical event. He would often tape drawings onto the canvas, rip them off, and reapply them, creating a collage-like effect that added to the disjointed, fractured reality of the image. This method was not about precision, it was about energy transfer. He was transferring the nervous energy of his own body directly into the material. The paint is the evidence of that transfer. It is thick, impasto, heavy with the weight of the artist's presence. This aligns him with the concept of action painting, a term coined by the critic Harold Rosenberg. While de Kooning disliked labels, the description fits. The canvas was an arena in which to act, not a picture plane to reproduce reality. Now let us address the elephant in the room, and let us not be politically correct about it. De Kooning's approach to the figure, particularly the female figure, has been called misogynistic, violent, and cruel. Critics have said he chopped women up, that he assaulted them with his brush. To view it only through that socio-political lens is to be intellectually lazy. It misses the point of the sheer existential desperation in his work. De Kooning was not attacking women. He was attacking the canvas. He was attacking the impossibility of capturing the reality of another human being. He was grappling with the terrifying power of the idol, the ancient goddess, the overwhelming force of the other. Art is not a safe space. It is a place where the id runs wild. De Kooning allowed his aggression, his lust, his fear, and his awe to pour out onto the canvas without a filter. That is why it feels dangerous. That is why, decades later, these paintings still have the power to offend and unsettle. They are honest about the violence inherent in desire and the violence inherent in creation. If you want safe, go look at a landscape painting. If you want the raw, unadulterated truth of the human psyche, look at de Kooning. Consider the historical context to inoculate yourself against the idea that this was just randomness. The mid-20th century was a time of immense upheaval. The atomic bomb, the aftermath of the Second World War, the rise of mass consumerism, all of this fed into the anxiety of the time. The abstract expressionists were responding to this anxiety, but where others sought silence or purity, like Rothko or Newman, de Kooning embraced the noise. He let the cacophony of the American century crash into his studio. His paintings are loud. They shout at you. They are full of the visual static of the modern age, and yet beneath that noise, there is a profound connection to the old masters. De Kooning loved Ingres, he loved Titian. He was trying to do what they did, paint the human drama, but in a language that fit his shattered times. He realized that you could not paint a harmonious Renaissance figure in a world that had seen Hiroshima and the Holocaust. The figure had to be broken because the world was broken. His command of space is another thing that separates him from the amateurs. He was a master of the cubist grid, but he broke the bars of the cage. Cubism, invented by Picasso and Braque, shattered the object into geometric planes. De Kooning took those planes and set them on fire. He made them fluid. He created a shallow space where forms overlap and interpenetrate in a way that defies logic, but feels completely right emotionally. He twists space. He creates a visual knot that your eye tries to untie, but never can. This keeps the painting alive. You can look at a de Kooning for 20 years and still see something new because the spatial relationships are so complex and ambiguous. It is like looking at a map of a war zone where the borders are constantly shifting. This is what formalists refer to as the tension between figure and ground. In a traditional painting, the figure sits in front of the background. In a de Kooning, the background eats the figure, and the figure slashes through the background. They are locked in a mortal struggle. This spatial ambiguity is what gives his work its terrifying velocity. There is no place for the eye to rest. You are constantly pushed from one area of the canvas to another by the directional force of the brushstrokes. It is a visual roller coaster, and he achieved this through an intuitive, almost mystical process of addition and subtraction. He would paint a section, then scrape it out, then paint over it again, but perhaps move the form 2 inches to the left. This created a vibration, a trembling in the image. Nothing is fixed. Everything is contingent. This mirrors the nature of reality itself. We like to think the world is solid and stable, but physics tells us it is just a swarm of atoms. De Kooning painted the atomic instability of existence. We must also talk about his later work, because it shows the evolution of a true master and creates a distinct chapter in his legacy. As he aged, the grit and the angst gave way to something else, a fluid, lyrical luminosity. The jagged, aggressive forms smoothed out into ribbons of pure color. The mud disappeared, replaced by the light of the Hamptons, whites, yellows, blues that sing with a clarity that is almost blinding. But the structure remained. There is a debate among scholars about the effect of his declining health and memory on these works. But the visual evidence suggests that even when his conscious mind began to fail him, his hand remembered. The muscle memory of the master painter was so deep, so ingrained in his neural pathways, that he could still weave these incredible, weightless compositions. It teaches us that style is not just a choice, it is a biological rhythm. De Kooning's rhythm was one of constant motion, a dance with the void. These late paintings are like exhaling after a lifetime of holding one's breath. They are open, airy, and strangely peaceful, yet they retain that signature twist, that refusal to be purely decorative. They are the visual equivalent of a late Beethoven quartet, spare, profound, and stripping everything down to the essentials. What is particularly fascinating about de Kooning, and what frustrates the rigid classifiers of art history, is his refusal to stay in one lane. Critics wanted him to be one thing. When he painted abstractly in his black and white period, they cheered. When he went back to painting figures, they booed and called him a traitor to the cause of modernism. But de Kooning did not care about the critics' rules. He famously said, "Flesh is the reason oil paint was invented." He understood that at its core, painting is a sensual act. It is about the love of the material world. By refusing to purify his art, by keeping the dirt and the body in it, he saved abstract art from becoming mere decoration. He kept it dangerous. He kept it human. He refused the dogma of purity that was preached by critics like Clement Greenberg. He knew that life is not pure. It is a mixture of the sublime and the ridiculous, and his art had to reflect that mixture. This humanity is evident in the way he treated the canvas itself. It was not a window to look through. It was a wall to write on. It was a surface to be scarred. The tactile nature of his work cannot be overstated. When you are in a museum, standing in front of one of his massive works, look at the edges. Look at where the paint clumps up. Look at the places where he stuck newspaper to the wet surface to keep it from drying overnight, and then peeled it off, leaving the ghost of the newsprint behind. These are not just images. They are objects. They are physical remnants of a performance. The performance was the act of painting, and the canvas is the debris left over. It captures the smell of the studio, the fumes of the turpentine, the dust of the loft. There is also a profound humor in de Kooning's work that often goes unnoticed by the overly serious academic. It is a dark, slapstick humor. The distorted faces, the bug eyes, the grimaces, they are grotesque, yes, but they are also funny in a cosmic, absurd way. He saw the absurdity of the human condition. He saw us as creatures of appetite and awkwardness. He did not idealize the human form. He exaggerated its lumpy, bumpy, messy reality. In doing so, he created a new kind of beauty, a beauty that includes the grotesque, the awkward, and the unpolished. This is a very American kind of beauty. It is not the refined beauty of Paris, it is the brawl of New York. It shares DNA with the jazz of the era, improvisational, discordant, but resolving into a complex harmony. Why should you care? Why does this matter to you, a person living in the 21st century with a smartphone in your pocket? It matters because we live in a world of slick surfaces. We live in a world of digital perfection, of Photoshop and filters, where everything is smoothed out, corrected, and made palatable. De Kooning is the antidote to that. He reminds us that life is messy. He reminds us that failure is a part of the process. Remember, he scraped off more images than he ever finished. He teaches us that there is beauty in the struggle, that the mark of the human hand, shaking, aggressive, uncertain, bold, is the most precious thing we have. He validates the chaos of your own internal life. When you look at his work, you are looking at a mirror of the modern soul, fractured, fast, overloaded, but undeniably alive. Furthermore, de Kooning's work stands as a testament to the power of ambiguity. In our current era, everyone demands clarity. Everyone wants to know exactly what side you are on, exactly what you mean, exactly what category you fit into. De Kooning rejects that. He revels in the maybe. He lives in the gray area where a shape can be a knee or a mountain, where a line can be a gentle caress or a violent slash. He teaches us to be comfortable with uncertainty. He shows us that meaning is not something you find pre-packaged. It is something you make. The viewer completes the painting. Your confusion, your attempt to make sense of the forms, is part of the art. This was not laziness. It was a philosophical stance. He believed that to name something was to kill it. By keeping the forms open, he kept them alive. Think about the sheer stamina required to paint the way he did. It was not just physical stamina, it was emotional stamina. To wake up every day and face a blank canvas, knowing that you might spend 10 hours working only to scrape it all off at the end of the day. That requires a specific kind of madness and a specific kind of faith. It is a faith in the process. De Kooning trusted that if he kept working, kept pushing the paint, kept engaging with the struggle, eventually something true would emerge. And it did. But it never emerged easily. It had to be fought for. This is a lesson for anyone trying to create anything. The easy way is rarely the right way. The thing that comes quickly is often superficial. Real depth comes from the struggle, from the willingness to destroy what you have done and start over. He was known to have worked on a single painting for over a year, revisiting it, attacking it, and courting failure every single day. De Kooning's use of color also deserves a deeper, more technical look. He did not use color just to fill in lines. Color was a structural element. He used dirty colors, ochres, muddy browns, grays, and set them against high-key, jarring colors like acidic yellows and bubblegum pinks. This created a visual tension that is almost uncomfortable. It is not a soothing palette, it is a palette that keeps you on edge. He captured the neon glare of the city and the grime of the pavement and mixed them together. It is the color of the urban landscape, metabolized and spit back out. It vibrates with the electricity of the street. But as he moved to Long Island in the 1960s, you see the palette shift. The highway landscapes emerge. He began to capture the blur of the green grass and the grey asphalt as seen from a moving car. He was translating the American experience of speed into color. Drawing was the backbone of his art. Even when the paintings look like total chaos, there is a rigorous structure of drawing underneath. He was constantly drawing, often with his eyes closed. He would do blind contour drawings, looking at the television or out the window while his hand moved across the paper. This was a way to bypass the censoring brain, to bypass the academic training that tells you how a hand or a face should look. He wanted to get to the raw sensory data of the form. He wanted to draw how it felt to have a hand, not what a hand looked like to a camera. This disconnect between the eye and the hand created those distorted, slip-sliding shapes that define his style. It was a deliberate strategy to break the habits of his own expertise. He had to unlearn his own skill, to find his own truth. Do not look for a story in his work. Do not ask, what is it supposed to be? That is the wrong question. Ask instead, how does it feel? Feel the speed of the brush. Feel the weight of the paint. Feel the tension between the black charcoal line and the white paint. De Kooning created a language of pure visual energy. He proved that paint itself, just the colored mud in a tube, could carry the full weight of human emotion, from the most tender caress to the most violent blow. He liberated the brushstroke from the job of describing a nose or a tree and let it just be a stroke, existing for its own sake, vibrating with its own power. This liberation of the mark is his greatest legacy. Before abstract expressionism, the brushstroke was usually subservient to the image. It was there to serve the illusion. De Kooning made the brushstroke the main character. The drama of the painting is not the story of a mythological hero. It is the drama of the paint itself meeting the canvas. It is the drama of wet meeting dry, of fast meeting slow, of smooth meeting rough. It is a drama of materials. And because we are material beings living in physical bodies, we respond to this on a primal level. We feel the sweep of the arm in our own bodies. We feel the aggression and the tenderness. It bypasses the intellect and hits us in the gut. Let us also consider the specific influence of the environment on his work, which grounded his abstraction in reality. When he worked in his loft in New York City, the paintings were gritty, vertical, compressed, full of the grime and vertical energy of the skyscrapers. When he moved to the Springs in East Hampton, the paintings opened up. The horizontal line of the landscape began to assert itself. The light of the ocean seeped into the canvas. The clamshell shapes and the rolling curves of the dunes appeared. He was a sponge, absorbing his surroundings and wringing them out onto the canvas. But he never painted a literal landscape. He painted the feeling of being in the landscape, the wind, the salt air, the rushing road. He famously said he liked to drive on the highways because he liked the sensation of the road rushing specifically towards him. That rushing perspective, that sense of the world coming at you fast, is embedded in every inch of his work. In the end, de Kooning's art is an affirmation of existence. It screams, I am here. It is a refusal to disappear. In a universe that is vast and indifferent, de Kooning carved out a space for the human ego, for the human flaw, and for the human hand. He showed us that we do not have to be perfect to be magnificent. We can be messy, conflicted, violent, and loving all at once. And we can make art out of that mess. He elevated the disruption, the smear, and the correction to the status of the sublime. So, the next time you see a de Kooning, do not walk past it. Stand there. Let it confront you. Let the dissonance rattle your teeth. It is supposed to be difficult. It is supposed to challenge you. He is offering you a glimpse into the furnace of creation. He is showing you that to build something real, you often have to tear everything else down. He is the Grandmaster of the smear, the poet of the scrap heap, the king of the glorious mess. And in a world that tries so hard to be perfect, his defiance is not just important, it is essential. It is the roar of the human spirit refusing to be contained by a clean line. That is why Willem de Kooning matters, because he dared to show us the beautiful, terrifying truth of what it looks like to be truly, apologetically alive. His work is a reminder that the act of living is itself an act of constant revision, a palimpsest of days and years where we scrape away the past to make room for the present, never quite erasing what came before, but building upon the ruins of our own history to create something complex, dense, and undeniable. He stood as a giant not because he had all the answers, but because he asked the most difficult questions with the most difficult materials. He challenged the canvas to a duel, and neither side won. Instead, they reached a stalemate of devastating beauty. That tension, that unresolved conflict, is where the life of the painting resides. It is not in the finish, but in the interruption. It is not in the silence, but in the shout. De Kooning shouted with color, he screamed with line, and he whispered with the erasure. He gave us permission to be fragmented. He gave us permission to be raw. And for that, we owe him our attention, our discomfort, and our awe. He remains the uncompromising titan of the brush, the man who painted not what he saw, but how it felt to see, leaving us with a legacy of visual thunder that echoes just as loudly today as it did when the paint was still wet.